Hi there. In the previous lesson, we talked about variables and how you can assign values to variables. And I told you in very simple terms, a variable is basically a pointer to a given value, and you can perform operations on these variables, such as add two numbers together. And if one variable contains a number and another variable contains a number, you can do arithmetic operations as well as combine two string variables and all sorts of things. And we talked about how a program runs line by line sequentially, and the values of the variables can change and so on. So in simple terms, a variable could be assigned something, and I told you to think of it as sort of like a pointer or a container. But it's obviously that's a gross oversimplification. In technical terms, a Python variable is a reserved memory location that stores a value, okay? And typically it's usually a pointer of some location in memory. We don't have to go into those technical details, so don't let that scare you. But what I want to talk about now is the concept of types, because we did touch upon types in the previous lesson. I'm only going to build upon that now. We talked about how a string variable could not be concatenated or added together with an integer variable, right? So if we try to do that, we get an error because the data types don't match. And what does adding the number 12 to a sentence, what does that actually mean, right? And so we need matching data types. And so I showed you how you can convert an integer into a string and then concatenate or combine the two strings together. So we were talking about types just to briefly in the previous lesson, and now I'm going to build upon that idea of data types. There are four primitive or basic data types in the Python language. One of them is an integer, which we talked about previously. Another one is string. We talked about that as well. Well, there's another one known as Boolean, which is meant to store either true or false values. And then finally, there's float, which is supposed to represent decimal numbers. So there's a very handy function that I want to introduce to you. And we talked about the print function in the previous lesson, right? You can print things by using the print function. Well, the function that I want to introduce to you now is known as type. Okay. And we're going to talk more about what a function even is later in more depth. But right now, just know that this is something that you can pass in a value inside of these parentheses. So if I pass in the number 12 and I hit this play button, let's run it. Obviously, nothing's going to happen unless I print this, right? So let me save whatever this, when this runs, it returns a value, and I want to assign that value to some variable. So that's why I have this equal sign, and then on the other side I'll say that this is a data type. Okay, and we want to separate data and type with this underscore. That's the naming convention for variables if you have compound words like this. So let's we're storing the type for the number 12 in the data type, and now I can print the data type like that. All right, so I want you to pay attention to what gets printed here when I run this. Notice right here, it prints. We're going to talk more about what a class is later, but notice it says int, and this is short for integer. So what's happening here is we are getting the type using the type function. We are getting the type for this value, and this value could be anything. It could be a variable, it could be a string, it could be anything. And so this type function will return the type of data that is. And we're assigning that type to this data type variable, and then we're printing the value of the data type variable, and that's why we see this int. Well, there are other types of data, right? Like I said, so you can have, if I change this to a decimal point, so I do 12.08, now this value is a decimal point. And running the type function on this value is going to assign the data type to this, and I can print that. So let's hit print, and notice this time it shows float. Okay, float is meant for decimal numbers. Now I can have a string in here, right? So let's change this to a string. Now I just surrounded this decimal number with quotes, right? So this is no longer a number. This is now a string because I surrounded it with quotes. And so if I hit run again, notice the data type here now is string, str. And by the way, this type function could be used on values like this, or I can put, of course, variables in there. So if I have the age variable and I assign it the number 43, I can have age in here, right? Hopefully that's straightforward. And it will return int in this case. So let's hit run, and there you go. Notice it's printing int, just to be clear, all right? Now, I want to introduce you to a Boolean. which is meant for either true or false values. Let's create a variable. On the top of my head, I can think of the word adult. So let's say that we have the adult variable, and it could either be true or false. So I'm going to type in true. Notice the syntax highlighting here. It gave a specific color. So this, when there's a color here, you can tell that this is a reserved word in the programming language, and this is supposed to mean true. There's another reserved word, false. That's supposed to, of course, represent false, right? And you can tell that the syntax color changes. If I just lowercase false, notice there's no syntax highlighting here, so this is not reserved. But with a capital F, it is. So when you're trying to assign either a true or false value to a given variable, you want to make sure you use the capital true with a capital T and the false with a capital F. These actually mean true and false. So now if I do the type for the variable adult, let me paste that in here in the type. And so now it's going to derive the type for adult, save that into the data type variable and print it out. So let's hit run and notice it's bool, right? Boolean. Bool data types can store only two values, either a true or a false. That's it. So just like I assigned this false or true value to the adult variable, I could, instead of passing in the variable, I can actually write true here in here. Whoops, make sure you spell it correctly. With the capital T, again, it's a reserved word. If I do all capital, it's no longer syntax highlighted. So this means basically nothing. So I have to make sure I use the correct reserved word. So now this, of course, is still going to return bool. So let's hit run and notice it's bool. So in Python, there are 4 basic data types, which I went over. There's the bool data type, there's the string data type, there's integer, and there is float for decimal numbers. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that we have a variable assignment up here. We're assigning it to false, and we're not utilizing this variable anywhere else in your code. And in your Python career, as a programmer, you're going to come across code that has extra code that doesn't need to be there, right? Especially in the case of Python. There are sometimes variables that are assigned and never really used to do anything, right? And that could just be because of old code that no one removed. So you definitely want to remove lines like that. I just want to make you aware that this variable here is not used anywhere, so we don't really need it. But let's say that if I wanted to give the adult value false here, and then later, if I gave the adult variable the value 24, and I check the type for adult right here. What do you think is going to be the data type? After this line, the data type is bool for adult. But after this line, the data type is changed to int. And that's why if we run it, it's going to show int. All right. And so this is what is known as dynamic typing in Python. All right. The types can change. The same variable could be used to store different types of data. On one line, we're assigning it a Boolean. On another line, we're assigning it an integer. And later on, I could probably assign adult the value string, some string value, okay? And it will continue to change its data type. This is different than statically typed languages, such as Java or C++. In those languages, you actually have to define the variable with the data type and say that only this kind of data could go in this type. So if you're defining a string data type, then only strings can go into that variable and nothing else. But in languages like Python, which are dynamically typed, you can continue to change the data type of these variables. So if I was to copy this line and paste it up here, and then paste it again down here, and paste it one more time down here, you'll see that the data types are changing as the code is running line by line. So let's hit run. Notice at first, adult is a bool, then it's an int, and then it's a string. So that's it. That wraps up this lecture. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.